There is a woman in Scripture whose name has been whispered for centuries, sometimes with judgment, sometimes with sorrow, and sometimes, when we look closer, with a quiet, holy wonder. Her name is Bathsheba. You may think you know her story. A rooftop, a king's wandering gaze, a letter sealed with royal wax that carried a death sentence for the man she loved. You may have heard her name spoken as a warning, a cautionary tale, a symbol of temptation and fall. But I want to invite you today to sit with her, really sit with her in the dust of grief, in the silence of a palace that never felt like home, in the ache of a mother who buried her firstborn, and in the breathtaking, undeserved mercy of a God who did not abandon her. Because Bathsheba's story is not simply a story about a king's sin. It is a story about a woman who had almost nothing that belonged to her, not her body, not her choices, not her mourning, and yet who ended her life seated beside the throne of Israel, the mother of the wisest king who ever lived. It is a story about what God does with broken things. It is a story about you, about the moments when life chose for you and left you standing in the wreckage, wondering if God still sees you, if He still counts you, if grace could possibly reach this far. It can, it does, it will. Come, let her speak. If you believe in the power of this story to touch the heart and transform thoughts, sign up now. Together, we can bring these teachings to those who haven't had the chance to hear them yet. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the city of Jerusalem as I knew it in my girlhood. The smell of cedar and stone. The sound of lambs in the lower markets. Their gentle bleating rising up through the narrow streets like a morning prayer. The way the sun, even in autumn, pressed warm and golden against the limestone walls of every house, filling the courtyards with a light that felt, if you were young and did not yet know grief, like the very presence of God. That is where I was born. That is where I belonged. My father's name was Eliam. He was a soldier, a man of valor, one of David's mighty men, those 30 warriors whose names were carved into the memory of Israel like letters into stone. I grew up watching him strap on his armor in the early mornings, the bronze buckles catching the light while my mother pressed her hands flat against his chest and whispered prayers over him that I was too small to hear clearly, but old enough to understand. She prayed for his return. She always prayed for his return. And every time he came home, smelling of dust and iron and long roads, she would close her eyes and breathe as though she had been holding her breath for weeks. Perhaps she had. I learned love from watching them. I learned that love is not simply the glow of a wedding day or the sweetness of first words. I learned that love is the long, faithful waiting, the open door, the bread kept warm, the prayer that doesn't stop even when the nights grow long and cold and uncertain. My grandfather was a Ahithophel. You may know that name. He was the most celebrated counselor in all the kingdom, a man whose wisdom was said to be like asking of God himself. When Ahithophel spoke, kings leaned forward. When Ahithophel gave his advice, the matter was considered settled before the words had finished falling from his lips. I adored him. He smelled of old parchment and olive oil. And when I was very young, he would sit me on his knee and trace the letters of the Torah in the air with one long, patient finger, naming each one as though he were introducing me to beloved friends. Aleph, Beth, Gimel, Dalet, the beginning of all things, he would say. Every word of God starts here. Every story starts here. Even yours, little one, even yours. I did not know then what story was being written for me. None of us ever do. When I was old enough to wed, they brought me to a man named Uriah the Hittite. I remember the first time I saw him. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with the careful, measured stillness of a man who had learned to control his body the way a potter controls clay, with steady hands and quiet authority. He was not from Israel. He had not been born into the covenant, into the stories of Abraham and Sarah, into the long, winding history of a God who chose a people and would not let them go. But Uriah had chosen that God for himself, and that I would come to understand. Is a faith more deliberate and more costly than any faith we inherit simply by being born into it? He observed every custom, every fast, every feast. He spoke of the Lord with a reverence that made me feel, at times, that I was hearing the Psalms being spoken aloud in an unfamiliar accent, the same holy words, but shaped by a tongue that had worked hard to learn their weight. Our home was simple, clean, a courtyard with a small garden where I grew herbs for cooking, hyssop, dill, bitter herbs that reminded us of Egypt and of freedom, of what it costs to be released from one kind of bondage only to enter another kind of wilderness. I swept the stones every morning. I carried water in the blue clay jar my mother had given me as a wedding gift. I learned the particular rhythm of a soldier's household. Weeks of ordinary life followed by weeks of empty rooms and cold nights, and the practice of trusting God with what you cannot see or hold. I will not say our marriage was passionate in the way the Song of Solomon describes, but it was faithful. And faithfulness, I have learned, is its own kind of beauty. Uriah was a good man. I need you to hear that, because what comes next will try to make you forget it. The world often reduces Uriah to a footnote in a story about a king's sin. But he was a whole person, a man with calloused hands and quiet convictions and a devotion to his God and his king that was, in the end, more pure than the king who betrayed him. He deserved better. We both did. The spring of the year came around again. In Israel, we called it the time when kings go out to battle, those long, warm months when armies moved and campaigns were fought, and women were left behind with their prayers and their waiting. Uriah kissed my forehead the morning he left. He smelled of leather and cedar smoke. "I will return to you," he said. I held his hand a moment longer than was necessary. I watched him walk down the street until I could no longer see the outline of his armor in the morning haze. Then I went inside and began to pray. "O Lord God of Israel, watch over him, guard his steps, bring him home." I did not know that prayer was already being answered in a way I could not imagine. I did not know that the home Uriah would return to would be a different kind of home entirely, one not made of stone and cedar, but of presence, of eternity. I did not know, but God did. And God, in His mercy, does not always tell us what He knows. He carries us instead. Reflect. Think of a time you were left behind, waiting, praying, trusting, without being able to see. How did God carry you through that season, even when you couldn't feel His arms? I want to speak carefully here. I want to speak carefully because this part of the story is the part that has been most misunderstood. The part where judgment has sometimes fallen on me in ways that are not entirely just. And I want to tell you what happened from inside the experience, not from outside looking in. It was evening. The air had finally cooled from the long heat of the day. I had been inside since morning, working in the dimness, and the coolness of the rooftop was, I will be honest, a relief. I was bathing according to our laws of purification, as every Jewish woman was required to do. This was not luxury. This was obedience. This was simply a woman doing what the law of Moses required. I did not know I was being watched. I did not know that the king had not gone to battle with his army that year. I did not know that he was restless and sleepless and walking on his own rooftop in the late hours when he should have been at war. I did not know that from the height of the palace's roof, the rooftops below were visible, including mine. I did not know any of this. What I knew was the coolness of the water, the quiet of the evening, the soft weight of the silence after the city had begun to settle into its night sounds. And then the messenger came. He stood at my door with the seal of the king pressed into clay, and he did not ask. Men with royal seals do not ask. They inform, they bring the summons, and they wait for you to come. I want you to understand what it meant to receive such a summons. I want you to understand what power was in that world in that moment. David was not simply a man I might have declined politely. He was the anointed of God. He was the king of all Israel. He was the warrior poet who had slain Goliath, who had led armies, who held in his hand the power of life and death over every person in the kingdom, including the soldiers at the front, including my husband. A woman of no power stands before the summons of a man of all power. There are no good choices there. There is only the door that opens, the street that leads upward toward the palace, and the long, terrible walk that tells you your life is no longer entirely your own. I will not describe that night in detail. Some things belong to silence and to God. What I will tell you is this: there was a version of me that died that night. The Bathsheba who had swept her clean courtyard and groaned her herbs and prayed for her husband's return, that woman walked up the hill to the palace and did not come home the same. I want you to understand grief before it is named grief. There is a kind of grief that arrives without announcement. It does not come wearing the formal robes of mourning. It comes dressed like an ordinary evening, like a cooling breeze, like the end of a day that seemed like every other day until suddenly it wasn't. That is the grief that undoes you most completely, because you don't realize at first what has been lost. The loss comes to you slowly over days and weeks, like water seeping into a cracked vessel, a little more each morning, a little heavier each night. I walked home in the early dark. The city was sleeping. The stones were cold beneath my feet. The stars above Jerusalem were the same stars that had always been there, constant, indifferent to the small human dramas playing out beneath them, burning their ancient light across every century of our sorrow. I looked up at them for a long time. God, I whispered, God, where are you? The stars did not answer, but something inside me, some stubborn, unbreakable thread of faith that my grandfather had woven into me one letter at a time, held Aleph, Beth, Gimel, Delete. The beginning of all things. Even this is not beyond the beginning of something. Weeks passed, and then I knew. The knowing arrived with the particular clarity of a morning when the world is very still and something inside your body speaks before your mind is ready to hear it. I was carrying a child. I sat with that knowledge for a long time before I sent word to the king. I held it inside me the way you hold a stone that is too heavy and too jagged to set down, but that cuts your hands when you hold it. There was no good outcome that I could see from where I was standing. There was only the weight of the stone and the blood on my palms, and the question of what God does with situations that have no clean solution. I sent word to David, 2 words, 4 words. Just enough to let him know what his choices had made. I am with child. I do not know what I expected. I do not know if I expected anything. Perhaps I had already stopped expecting the world to behave as it should. Perhaps that is the particular education of powerlessness. You learn slowly and at great cost that fairness is not a feature of the world as it is, but a hope for the world as it will be. What happened next, I learned only later, in pieces, through whispered words from women who moved in and out of palace rooms and carried news in the folds of their garments like seeds. Uriah had been called home from the front. The king had offered him rest, wine, the comfort of his own home, had offered him a night with his wife, which would have obscured, conveniently, the timing of the child. And Uriah, my faithful, honor-bound, and possibly principled Uriah, had refused. He slept on the steps of the palace with the servants. The ark is in a tent, he said. My commander, Joab, is in the field. How could I go to my house to eat and drink and lie with my wife? As the Lord lives and as your soul lives, I will not do this. When I heard those words later, much later, after everything, I wept. I wept not from guilt alone, though guilt was there. I wept because the man I had been given was, in his deepest self, a better man than the king who had taken what was his. I wept because goodness sometimes arranges itself in exactly the wrong position to survive the cruelty of the world. I wept because I could not protect him. I could not protect him, and I did not know yet that no one was going to. Reflect. Have you ever been in a situation where you had no power and no good choice, where life simply happened to you? How did you find God in that helplessness? There are days in a life that arrive like any other and leave like nothing you have ever survived before. The day the messenger came was a day like that. He did not have to say much. I could read the weight of it in the way he stood, the particular stillness of someone who carries news that will break a woman open and has already rehearsed the words and still does not know how to say them. Uriah was dead. He had been placed at the front of the battle, the most exposed position, the most certain death. And then the men around him had been ordered to withdraw, leaving him alone in the advance, as exposed as a lamp set in an open field on a dark night. Visible to every arrow, every sword, every soldier of the enemy who understood what such a position meant. It was not an accident. I knew it was not an accident. I think I had known. Somewhere in the hollow places of my chest where a woman knows things before she has words for them, that this was the outcome the king had arranged, that the letter Uriah had carried back to the front, cheerfully, faithfully, never thinking to break a king's seal and read his own death warrant, had made the arrangements final. My husband had carried his own death sentence in his own hands. Without knowing, the grief of that undoes me even now, even in the retelling. Even after decades of God's mercy layered over the wound like healing skin over a deep cut, I can press on it and feel still the ache of what that was. I tore my garments. I put on sackcloth and sat in the ashes of my grief the way our tradition required, not as performance, not as theater, but as truth made visible on the outside of a body that was already broken on the inside. Sometimes ritual is the only container wide enough to hold what we feel. Sometimes the oldest gestures are the ones that allow us to feel without being entirely consumed by the feeling. I mourned Uriah with everything in me. I mourned the breakfast we would never share again. I mourned the sound of his boots in the courtyard. I mourned the way he said my name, not tenderly, not passionately, but steadily. The way you say the name of something you have decided to keep, something you have committed yourself to in the presence of God. I mourned the ordinary life I had been building, one swept stone at a time. I mourned the future that had belonged to both of us and now belonged to neither. When the mourning period ended, David sent for me again. This time there was no question of refusal or acceptance. There was a royal household and a child on the way and a king who had by now tangled himself so completely in the web of his own choices that the only way forward in the world's eyes was to make me his wife. I became queen. You might think that sounds like rescue. Perhaps from the outside, it looked like rescue, the elevation of a widow to a palace, the exchange of a simple soldier's house for a court of marble and linen and servants and fine oil and every material comfort that Israel could offer. But I want to tell you what a palace feels like when you are not entirely free within it. It feels like a beautiful cage. It feels like being wrapped in silk over wounds that haven't healed. It feels like being seen by everyone and known by almost no one. The other wives were polite, some were kind, but they had their histories with David, their children already placed in the hierarchy of the household, their alliances and their territories mapped out over years I had not been present for. I arrived carrying grief and guilt and a child, and I carried all three alone. David was a man of extraordinary gifts, poetry, music, courage, devotion to God. And also I came to understand a man of deep shadows. He was capable of great tenderness and also great distance. He could write about the Good Shepherd with a beauty that made your soul ache, and then spend weeks entirely unreachable behind the walls of his own thoughts. I prayed often in those days, prayed with my face to the floor and my words coming out in no particular order, because that is how prayer often comes, not in the beautiful shaped sentences of the Psalms, but in the broken, unfinished, desperate fragments of a heart that is trying to find its way back to God in the dark. Lord, I don't know how to live here. I don't know who I am in this place. I know that I have sinned, and that sin found me, and I'm living inside the consequences now, and I'm asking you, please, do not abandon me here. Please do not let this be the whole of my story. The child came, a boy. I held him in the first hours of his life, that particular holding, when a child is new enough that he still smells of heaven, when his weight in your arms is the most specific, most irreplaceable weight in the world. And I felt something shift in me. Some locked room inside me opened. He was mine. Whatever had been taken from me, whatever I had lost or had stripped away, this boy in this moment was mine. And then Nathan came, the prophet Nathan, sent by God. He sat across from David and told him a story about a rich man who had many flocks and a poor man who had only one small lamb, a lamb that slept in his arms and drank from his cup and was as dear to him as a daughter. And when a traveler came to the rich man, rather than take from his own abundance, the rich man took the poor man's only lamb and slaughtered it. David's face went red with anger. That man deserves to die, he said. That man has no pity. And Nathan looked at the king of Israel and said 4 words that shook the foundations of the palace. You are that man. I was not in the room, but the words reached me. They always do, the words that are true. They don't need direct delivery. They travel on the air like the scent of rain before a storm. You feel them coming before they arrive. And then Nathan delivered the consequence. The child would not live. I fell to my knees on the cold stone floor, not in performance, not in the practiced gesture of a woman who knows how to look broken, but in the raw, formless, uncontrollable grief of a mother who has just been told that the one irreplaceable thing, the one weight in her arms that belonged to her, is going to be taken. David fasted and prayed for 7 days. I did not eat either. I prayed in the manner of someone who believes in miracles because she has seen them. Who prays because prayer is the only posture that makes sense when you have no other power? Who holds the word please in her mouth like a stone and cannot bring herself to swallow it or spit it out? Please, please, please. On the 7th day, the baby's breathing changed. I knew before they told me. Mothers always know. They brought him to me afterward, and I held him in that same way, the irreplaceable weight. The smell of heaven still faintly on him, and I rocked him and I wept and I let myself be entirely broken, because some griefs require it. Some griefs will not be survived any other way than by going all the way down into them and letting God find you there at the bottom. Reflect. Have you ever suffered a loss that felt like more than you could carry? One that seemed to come as a consequence of choices, yours or someone else's? How did you find grace at the bottom of that grief? There is a moment after the worst has happened when the world becomes very quiet, not peaceful, not resolved, just quiet. The noise of the crisis passes. The people stop coming in and out of the room. The prayers spoken aloud give way to silence. And you are left with yourself and God and the enormous, unanswerable question of what comes next. I sat in that silence for a long time. I did not rush to fill it. I had learned by then that the silence is not empty, that God is not absent in it, that sometimes the silence is the most holy thing because it is the space where grief is allowed to finish, where the soul stops fighting long enough to let healing begin its slow, patient work. David came to me. I want to be careful about how I describe this, because David was a complicated man who had done a terrible thing and was now living in the long aftermath of it, just as I was. We were two broken people in a palace, connected by sin and loss, and a shared grief that neither of us entirely knew how to carry. He came to me and he comforted me, and it was comfort. Imperfect, insufficient in some ways, mixed with all the complexity of our history, but it was real. Something in him reached towards something in me, and for a moment the grief became slightly less solitary. Solitude in grief is its own particular weight. To grieve alongside another person, even a flawed one, even one whose choices helped bring you to this place, is still lighter than grieving utterly alone. I conceived again, and when the child was born, this time healthy, this time crying with the particular insistent vigor of a child who intends to stay, Nathan the prophet came to us with a message from God. "His name shall be Solomon," David said, "for the Lord loves him." And Nathan, who had spoken judgment before, now spoke a second name, a private name, a name between God and this child, Jedediah, beloved of the Lord. And I held that name in my heart like a coal. It burned with a warmth I had not felt in a long time. Beloved of the Lord, not condemned, not stained by the circumstances of his conception, not sentenced to carry forever the history of his parents' sin. Beloved, I want every person listening to me right now to hear that word directed at themselves. Because whatever your story is, whatever grief you carry, whatever shameful chapter you keep folded and hidden in the back of your history, God has a name for you too. He looked at a child born from the worst chapter of my life and called him beloved. He looks at you from inside your worst chapter and calls you beloved. That is who he is. I raised Solomon with everything in me. Every lesson my grandfather Ahithophel had taught me. Every letter of Torah traced in the air with a patient finger. Every word of wisdom offered over oil lamps in the evening quiet I passed to my son. I taught him that wisdom is not merely intelligence, that intelligence is a tool, but wisdom is a posture, the willingness to stand before God and say, I do not have enough light to see what I am doing. Give me yours. I told him the stories, not the shameful parts first, but the whole of it, the beauty of the covenant, the faithfulness of God across generations, the way the Lord had brought Israel out of slavery and through the wilderness and into this land, this particular land where the stone walls turned gold at sunset and the hills rolled southward toward Bethlehem, and the air smelled always, just faintly, of something eternal. I told him, God does not require perfection, Solomon. He has never required perfection. He requires honesty. He requires a heart that turns back to him when it strays. Not a heart that never strays, because no such heart exists, but a heart that knows the way home. Solomon listened the way children listen, when they sense that what they are being told is not simply a lesson, but a life, a distilled life, pressed into words and given to them as a gift. He had his father's eyes, dark and deep and capable of seeing around corners. He had, I hoped, something of my stubbornness, my refusal to let grief have the final word. There were years of difficulty, years of palace intrigue, and the terrible sorrows of David's family, Absalom's rebellion, the grief of a father watching a son he loved choose destruction over reconciliation. I witnessed those years from within the palace, and they taught me something about the cost of choices that ripple outward from a single moment. David's sin had consequences he did not foresee. They always do. That is the nature of sin. It does not contain itself neatly within the boundaries of the moment in which it is committed. It spreads. It touches people who were not present for the original choice. It changes the shape of things for years afterward. I had to choose in those years whether to carry bitterness or to lay it down. I want to be honest with you. It was not a single choice. It was not one dramatic moment of release where I let go of the anger and the grief and walked forward into a sunlit future. It was a daily choice, sometimes a moment-by-moment choice. The choice to say, God, I'm not going to close my hand around this one more day. I'm going to open my hand and give it to you, knowing you may have to pry it back open tomorrow because I will pick it up again in the night. Forgiveness is not a door you walk through once. It is a door you find yourself standing in front of repeatedly, and you have to decide each time to go through again. Oh God, I prayed in those years, you are the God who redeems. You are the God who takes what is broken and does not discard it, but reshapes it. You are the God who met Hagar in the wilderness and met Jacob at the ford and met Moses in the burning bush, who meets people in their worst moments and calls them by name. Meet me here. Call my name? Remind me who I am in you. And he did. He always did. Not always loudly, not always with signs and wonders and the voice of thunder. Sometimes just a morning that arrived gentler than the night before it. Sometimes just a moment in which Solomon laughed at something ordinary and the laugh sounded so entirely alive that all the darkness pulled back a little and there was light. And I thought, this is enough. This is enough to keep going. This moment is enough. Reflect. Where in your own story has God placed something unexpected? A child, a relationship, a calling that became evidence of his mercy in the middle of your consequences? Can you name it today and give thanks? David was old. I had watched him age the way I watched the olive trees age and the hills around the city, slowly, gradually, the bark thickening, the branches growing heavier, the gnarled beauty of a long life becoming more visible as the years accumulated. He was still, in his final years, capable of poetry that could stop your breath. He was still capable of worship so genuine and so abandoned that it made the palace feel like a temple. But he was old, and the question of succession had been circling the palace for years, like a bird that circles before it lands, patient, inevitable, casting its shadow across every room. Adonijah, David's son by another wife, had declared himself king. He had gathered supporters. He had made sacrifices. He had thrown a feast and invited the sons of the king and the commanders of the army, and conspicuously, deliberately had not invited Solomon. I knew what that meant. I had lived long enough in the palace to understand that when a man begins to act as though he has already won, he is also announcing the fate of those who stand in his way. Solomon was my son. He was the child God had named beloved. He was the one David had promised, in the name of the Lord, would sit on the throne of Israel. And I was his mother. There is a courage that belongs specifically to mothers, a courage that has nothing to do with the absence of fear and everything to do with the presence of love. A mother who has already buried one child and raised another through the full complexity of palace life does not have much left to be afraid of. I had learned to be afraid of the right things and not the wrong ones. I went to the king. I bowed with the full respect due to him, not merely protocol, but genuine honor, because whatever David had been and whatever he had done, he was still the anointed of God, still the man who had written the 23rd Psalm, still someone I had lived beside long enough to see the full complicated measure of. And I spoke clearly. My lord the king, do you not remember your promise? You swore to me by the Lord your God that Solomon, our son, would reign after you. And now Adonijah has taken the kingdom without your knowledge. My lord, the eyes of all Israel are upon you to tell them who shall sit upon your throne. If this is not resolved today, when you're gone, Solomon and I will be counted as criminals. I did not weep. I did not plead. I simply spoke the truth, plainly, clearly, with the particular authority of a woman who has survived enough to know that truth does not need theatrical decoration. It only needs to be said. David summoned Nathan, he sent for Zadok the priest. He gave his instruction clearly and without hesitation. Solomon would be king today, not tomorrow. Not after more negotiation or more political maneuvering. Today, they brought Solomon to Gahan on David's own mule. They anointed him with oil. They blew the trumpet, and the people, all the people, shouted, "Long live King Solomon!" The shouting was so loud it shook the ground. The story goes that the earth itself seems to split with the sound of it. Anijah's feast not far away heard the noise, and the guests rose from their tables, one by one, and slipped away in the silence of understanding that the moment had passed. It was over. Solomon was king, and Bathsheba, the woman who had been watched from a rooftop, who had been summoned without being asked, who had buried a husband and a child, and walked through the long valley of grief and consequence. I became the queen, mother, Gavira, lady, the queen mother of Israel. A throne was brought and set beside Solomon's own. When I walked into the throne room, my son, the king, rose and bowed to me. He had a throne placed on his right hand, the place of honor, the place of the favored. I sat down in it slowly, because when God does something this particular and this undeserved, you do not rush. You take a breath and you let it settle. You let the weight of it reach all the way down into the places where the grief used to live, and allow the grace to touch even those hidden rooms. Solomon would go on to ask God for wisdom above all else. Not wealth, not long life, not victory over enemies. Wisdom. When I heard what he had asked for, I closed my eyes. I thought of my grandfather tracing letters in the air above my head. I thought of the morning prayers my mother had whispered with her hands pressed flat against my father's chest. I thought of Uriah, who chose his God deliberately and honored that choice even when no one was watching. I thought of the rooftop and the night and the long walk home under stars that kept burning through everything. And I thought, wisdom is what you learn in the places where everything else fails. Wisdom is what is left after the pride is gone and the certainty is gone and the plans you made with such confidence have fallen apart, and you are standing in the rubble asking God which direction is forward. My son had asked for the one thing a mother who has lived my life would have told him to ask for. Perhaps he had learned something, after all. Perhaps the lessons pressed into a child late at night in a palace full of complicated sorrows do not disappear. Perhaps they wait the way seeds wait through a dry season, patient eyes invisible, holding the whole of their life compressed in their small, hard centers until the conditions are right, and then they split open and grow. I believe in that kind of patient faithfulness. I have had to. What do I want you to take away from my story? Not guilt. Not the moralistic lesson of a cautionary tale that says, be careful or this could happen to you. I want you to take away this. God is not finished with you in your worst chapter. He was not finished with me on the rooftop night. He was not finished with me in the morning ashes. He was not finished with me in the palace that felt like a cage, or in the years when I was raising a son with one hand and fighting despair with the other. He was working. He is always working. Slowly, patiently, the way he works in all the processes of creation, not rushing, not panicking, not abandoning the project because it has become complicated or because the raw material is more broken than he might have preferred. He takes the broken clay and he keeps working. And what he makes from it, what he made from me, is not in spite of the breaks. It is sometimes because of them. The places where the clay was most broken are sometimes the places where the final vessel is most beautiful, because the repair shows through, and the repair is evidence of the hand of God. Your story is not over. Your worst chapter is not your last chapter. The God who said to my son, you are beloved, says it to you now in this moment, wherever you are receiving this story. Whatever weight you are carrying, whatever room you are sitting in, whatever grief you have not yet named aloud, You are beloved. You're not beyond his reach. You're not too broken to be made into something beautiful. Come, sit with him a while. Let him trace the letters. Aleph, Beth, Gimel, Dalet, the beginning of all things, even yours, even now, even here. Final prayer. Lord, you are the God who sees. Eller, Oro. The one who found Hagar in the desert, who saw Bathsheba in her grief, who sees me now, or the God who does not discard the broken, but redeems it. Take my story, all of it, the beautiful and the shameful, the parts I am proud of and the parts I have buried, and do with it what only you can do. Make it into something that points towards you. I trust you. Amen. Application. This week, find one area of your life where you have believed the lie that what happened there disqualifies you from God's best. Write it down. Lay it before God and ask him to show you, as he showed Bathsheba, what he is building in you that you cannot yet see. If you believe in the power of this story to touch the heart and transform thoughts, sign up now. Together, we can bring these teachings to those who haven't had